March! My name is Captain Ian Garriott. I'm assigned to Ladder 8 on 1 unit. And today we are going to demonstrate and discuss the care, maintenance, and lubrication of aerial tillers. We'll be using Ladder 8, which is a 2019 Pierce. The model is an Aero XT Ascendant ladder. It has a 107-foot reach and a tip load of around 750 pounds. Even though your ladder may be different, you may have the first generation Pierce, or you may have some of the extra LTIs that still exist in our fleet today. The concept is very similar. So what we're showing you here can still apply to those ladders itself. But what I recommend is that you refer to your owner's manual for specifics on grease points and grease locations. So I really think why do we grease our ladders? Why is it important to grease our ladders and maintain our equipment? Well, I think there's like 3 primary reasons. First of all, it's going to result in an overall smooth operation. We're also going to have less maintenance performed because we're properly maintaining the equipment. And one of the most important reasons, I think, is the longevity of our equipment. It's no secret that this apparatus is going to be with us for years to come, so let's maintain that equipment. All right, so we are going to talk about the cleaning supplies that are needed for this entire process. But before we start with that, really we want to talk about how often are we supposed to do this process? How often are we supposed to prep the ladder for new grease? The manual says every 6 months or 3,000 miles. So each ladder in City of Columbus is getting greased at least once a year for its annual testing. At a minimum, we should be doing it twice a year. According to Pierce, it's every 3,000 miles or 6 months, whichever comes first. Some ladders may actually need more greasing because of their use. But where do we get our supplies? Well, our supplies we can get from 3 different places. We can get from either our monthly supply, or we can get from the shop parts department, or we can actually get them from tools and equipment. If you have questions on where to get some of these, I suggest you just reach out to those offices and ask them. But what are we going to need for today? Well, we're going to start with what we have set up here. We got various types of degreasers. We have simple green, tough duty. You can have 409. We'll need basic Joy soap or dish soap. We'll need truck soap. We're going to need box of gloves. We're going to need chain and cable lubricant. We're going to need 2 types of grease, and I'm going to go over these shortly. We're going to need automatic transmission fluid. We're also going to need grease guns, usually 2. We're going to need a box of shock rags. We're going to go through quite a bit of shock rags as we go through this process. And then what I like to use is we have a plastic putty knife or just a plastic flexible like stucco piece of plastic to help remove grease, and I'll go over that in a little bit. And then we also have various just throwaway brushes that we'll be using to apply grease. Let's go over the types of grease. There's 2 primary types of grease we're going to use. So we have Super Lube Synco. So Super Lube Synco is a all-purpose synthetic grease. Pierce manual recommends Super Lube Synco specifically, and for the various parts of the apparatus. Those parts are the waterway swivel joint, and I will go over these later, but we're going to use these Super Lube on the waterway swivel joint, we're going to use it on the waterway bearings, and then we're going to use it on the rails themselves. So that would be the bottom and the middle section. Anywhere where the rail slides along the glide box, and I'll show you what those are shortly. We also use a Mollygraph Heavy Duty number 2 grease. So if you're not sure which grease you have in the gun because it's not labeled, the Heavy Duty number 2 grease is usually a darker in color. It could either be black, and I think what we have now is a purple, but I'm not quite sure. I'll have to wait until we open it up and look. But what are we going to use the Heavy Duty number 2 grease for? So there's a lot of components that we use this grease, Heavy Duty grease for, and if you think about this type of grease is used where metal is rubbing on metal, whereas the synthetic grease is usually it's not metal on metal. It's going to be metal on plastic. or just seals, but this is metal on metal. Where would we use this? Well, the fifth wheel bearing, the fifth wheel lockout cylinder pins, and again, we will show you these. We have the rotation bearing, or the rotation turntable bearing. We have the fifth wheel bearing teeth. We have the monitor, and then we also have the pulleys, which the manual may call shivs. The lubricant, the chain and cable lubricant, is just for the wire rope or the cables on the aerial itself.
Right.
Now that we have our cleaning supplies set up and ready to go, we're going to start with what we call phase one. Phase one is where we set up the aerial and we fully extend the aerial so we have access to the rails and the various parts. Today we're at Groves Road. We're at Bay 25. I've reserved this bay through the FMLO office, and I like this bay for a reason, because of the ramp. This allows the firefighters to walk alongside or underneath the aerial itself instead of climbing up and down ground ladders. We're going to take this opportunity to talk about Zerk fittings. This is a Zerk fitting, and the reason I'm mentioning a Zerk fitting is because there are numerous Zerk fittings throughout the ladder. What is a Zerk fitting? Basically, a Zerk fitting is an injection port for grease, and we need to prep the Zerk fitting prior to putting or applying new grease. And when we do that process, we take a clean rag and we wipe the Zerk, and what we're doing is preventing old dirty grease from being injected into the area that we're trying to apply new grease. We'll then take the grease gun and attach it to the Zerk fitting, and then we will apply 2 pumps. If it's a well-maintained ladder or well-maintained device, typically 2 pumps is all you'll need. If it hasn't been greased in a long time, it could be more than 2. We're now going to demonstrate wiping and prepping and then applying new grease. All right, so we are going to start with the rails. So we have a middle section, we have the exterior section, and what we want to do is remove this old grease. And what we're doing is prepping the ladder for new grease. The issue with grease is over time, grease will collect small bits of gravel and debris. And what that can cause is problems with the sliding in and out. It actually hinder the operation of the area. And it'll interfere with the guide blocks, and I'll show you those here in a second. But what we're going to do is take the plastic putty knife or some kind of plastic scraper, and we're going to remove this grease, and then we'll come back over with a clean rag that's damped with a degreaser. And not only are we going to do the top, but we're going to do the bottom as well. We also have channels within the ladder that you step up on top of the aerial itself, look down, and those channels need cleaned and prepped as well. Now we're going to demonstrate taking off some of the old grease and prepping for new grease. Now you can see, as Mike prepared this isn't dinner plate clean, right? But this is just, all we need to do is just remove old grease and prep it for new grease, and that's all we're doing here. Next, I want to show you the glide box. All right, so we mentioned earlier glide pads, but I've also heard glide blocks, but this is them. They're usually white in color, and they look a lot like our cutting boards in the kitchen. But when we're prepping the aerial for new grease, you can see this buildup of grease. This is old grease that just gets caked on as the ladder extends and contracts. We want to wipe that off with our putty knife and a rag soaked and degreaser and prep for new grease. Now we're going to demonstrate removing old grease from the inside of the channels. We've already paid attention to the exterior of the rails. Don't forget the channels. The process is the same. Take a scraper, remove old grease, come back over with a rag dampened with a degreaser. We're removing old grease to prep for new grease. All right, we have now prepped the rail for new grease. So again, we're going to use the Super Lube Synco. It's an all-purpose grease. And when you apply the grease, we can either use a brush like this, or we could use a gloved hand, and we can open a tube and we can stick our fingers in and lightly apply the grease in a circular motion. Remember though, this is not like a cake. This just needs to be a really small film of grease on the rail itself. So it'll be applied here, and it'll be applied in the bottom, and it'll also be applied in the channels. So at this point, I'm going to show, Mike is going to go ahead and apply some Super Lube to the rail. And you see that Mike had opened a tube of Super Lube, and he's just using a gloved hand. We find that this is the fastest way because you don't always have a brush available.
Go.
Now that we've finished the rails, we're going to jump into the pulleys. Now, each truck has a different set number of pulleys, so you just really need to look at your specific truck or look at the manual. But when addressing a pulley, we have a Zerk fitting, and then we also have a buildup of old grease. So we need to remove this old grease, again with a rag, damped with a degreaser, clean the Zerk fitting, and prepare for new grease. This will be heavy duty number 2 grease. John's going to show us how to prepare a pulley for new grease. So now that we've finished the pulleys, we're going to move on to the cables. The manuals will refer to them as wire rope, but here in the division we refer to these as cables. I want to start off by saying we need to be careful when we start this process, because there's a term called porcupining, and it's where the cable itself, because this is wire, if some of them are frayed, it could stick out and it could stab you. But what we're going to need to do is prep this cable for new lubricant. In order to do that, we're going to take a rag that is soaked in a soap and water. Just a Joy soap will be fine. We have our gloved hand, and then we will gently just rub it along the cable and along the whole length of each cable on the ladder. All we're doing is removing old grease from the cable. Once that has been removed, we will then apply new lubricant, and that's the can that I showed you earlier in the supplies, which is the chain and cable lubricant spray. We'll spray it on a gloved hand and then just rub your hand over each cable the length of the cable itself. We do not, and this is important, we do not use a solvent or brake cleaner, and we do not power wash our wire ropes. The manual says over and over again not to use solvents, and definitely don't power wash. It could lead to cable failure, which then could lead to overall ladder failure. Alex is going to demonstrate removing old grease from the cable and then applying a cable lubricant. All right, so now we're moved on to the waterway swivel. So we're up on the turntable itself, and this is it right here. This is the whole waterway swivel, but there is one Zerk fitting on our ladder, and I'm shining the light right on it. Now, this is the one grease point that the manual says do not over grease. Now, we will use the all-purpose synthetic grease the Superlube Synco. And since it says do not over grease, I can't find in there exactly like how often they recommend you do it. They just say don't over grease it. So at this point, my suggestion is once a year. 2 pumps of grease once a year, and that's all we're going to do. So right now Mike's going to prep that Zerk fitting by cleaning it, and then we're going to apply 2 pumps of Superlube Synco to the waterway swivel. All right, so now we've done the swivel, we're now moving on to the waterway bearing. This ladder in particular has 3 sets of bearing, and on each bearing there are 2 Zerk fittings. This is the Superlube Synco grease, all-purpose grease, and again we'll need to prep the Zerk fittings and then apply 2 pumps of grease. Now the manual is very specific when it's addressing that you grease the entire ladder every 3,000 miles or 6 months. But when it comes to the waterway, anytime we flow water through this waterway device, we need to grease the bearing and grease the exterior tube. And I'll cover the tube shortly. So if you're a day of training or you're in a defensive operation and you're flowing water, when you're finished, we need to apply grease. Mike's going to demonstrate cleaning the Zerk fittings and then prepping for Superlube grease. All right, we finished the waterway bearings. Now we're going to move to the exterior waterway tube. Now, the waterway tube is black in color on most of our trucks. What we need to do is prep it for automatic transmission fluid. Before we apply the automatic transmission fluid, we're going to take a rag with some degreaser and we're going to wipe around each seal where the tube slides within the bearing. We'll wipe that, and then we'll wipe the entire tube in prepping for the automatic transmission fluid. Once it's wiped, we'll come back with a clean rag with ATF, and we will wipe it on the tube. It should have a mirror-like finish when it's done. Mike's going to demonstrate prepping. So now we're moving on to the outriggers. The manual will refer to them as stabilizer beams, but here in Columbus Fire we call them outriggers. So we'll have the lower part of the outrigger, and then we have the inside where the torque box is, and then we also have the outrigger pads, swivel pads. But what we'll do is we'll need to prep this lower section of the outrigger by removing old grease. This section here, we'll need to remove grease, and if you get inside, you'll be able to see where grease accumulates. So we'll wipe that off. Usually we'll use a putty knife or a plastic scraper, and then go over it with the degreaser, and then prep it for new grease. New grease is heavy duty number 2. Heavy duty number 2 is used on the outrigger, and is used on the outrigger swivel pads. The swivel pads have this particular truck has 2 Zerk fittings per outrigger. So one on the back and one on the front. And we'll need to prep the Zerk fitting as we've been doing for the rest of the truck. John's going to jump in, and he's going to show prepping and then applying new grease. sections. Last part of phase one is buttoning up the truck in preparation for phase two. When we pick up, we're going to pick up out in the parking lot and we'll begin phase two. When bedding the ladder, a smart safety tip would be to always have a firefighter standing on the flight deck next to the tiller cab, within eyesight of the operator at the pedestal. What this ensures is, one, that the aerial is fully retracted, and that when we're lowering the aerial, that we are not going to crush the tiller cab, break the tiller cab windshield, or drive the monitor or the waterway through the diamond plate. Remember, at this point, the operation is over. Everyone's tired, and it's just easy to take our time and make sure that we put the truck away safely. Now we've moved on to phase two. Phase two is dealing primarily with the fifth wheel. This is the fifth wheel assembly, this entire piece. But within the fifth wheel, there are individual components. So we're going to be dealing with the fifth wheel bearing, the fifth wheel lockout cylinder pins, the turntable rotation bearing, and then the fifth wheel rotation gear teeth. We're going to start with the fifth wheel bearing. Now, if you look at ladder 8 has this assembly right here. That is called the Vogel Auto Lube grease system. Not every Pierce has the Vogel grease system. We do. If you do not have the Vogel grease system, you're going to have more Zerk fittings visible than what you have right here with ladder 8. So again, you need to refer to your specific manual for your ladder. But for greasing the fifth wheel bearing on ladder 8, there are two Zerk fittings. There's one underneath, and we'll show you these a little bit more detailed in a little bit. And then there's one right behind this auto lube system right here. Now there is a process when lubing the fifth wheel bearing. First of all, you need to jackknife the ladder to 90 degrees, starting on either the officer side or the driver's side. Today we are starting on the officer side, jackknifed 90 degrees. And what we need to do is we will hit each Zerk fitting. First you need to prep it, as we've done in phase one, but then you will hit each Zerk fitting with 2 pumps of grease. You will then reposition 20 degrees, grease again, 20 degrees, grease again, 20 degrees. This is a total of 10 positions all the way till you're 90 degrees on the opposite side of the vehicle. Now when you park the vehicle and when you reposition, it's very important that every time that you put it in neutral and then you set the parking brake. Then you apply the grease, you reposition, set it in neutral, apply the parking brake. And again, this is 10 positions of grease for the fifth wheel bearing. We're now going to demonstrate greasing the fifth wheel bearing on ladder 8. Now there is a process when lubing the fifth wheel bearing. First of all, you need to jackknife the ladder to 90 degrees, starting on either the officer side or the driver's side. Today we are starting on the officer side, jackknifed 90 degrees. And what we need to do is we will hit each Zerk fitting. First you need to prep it, as we've done in phase one, but then you will hit each Zerk fitting with 2 pumps of grease. You will then reposition 20 degrees, grease again, 20 degrees, grease again, 20 degrees. This is a total of 10 positions all the way till you're 90 degrees on the opposite side of the vehicle. Now that we finished the fifth wheel bearing and we're back in line position, we're going to move on to the fifth wheel lockout cylinder pins. So to point out fifth wheel lockout cylinder pins, if you look underneath here at the fifth wheel, they look like big shocks or pistons, and they're running at an angle up and down. These are the lower fifth wheel lockout cylinder pins. But if you look on ladder 8, it's part of the auto loop system. So we have hosing that leads to the back end. Some of our Pierces don't have the auto loop system, so there's actual Zerk fittings. That's where you would have to prep and then apply 2 pumps of heavy duty number 2 grease. But what we do have is our upper lockout cylinder pins, and it has 1 Zerk fitting on the bottom of each pin. There's 1 on each side. So the guys are going to prep the Zerk fitting, and they're going to apply 2 pumps of heavy duty number 2 grease. Now we've moved on top of the turntable, and we're going to grease the turntable rotation bearing. Now on ladder 8, as you see, there's a badge that says rotation bearing grease. There's a Zerk fitting right there. We're going to prep that Zerk fitting, and then we're going to apply grease. But how this grease is applied is a 2 firefighter operation. It's going to be a firefighter running the controls at the pedestal and another firefighter standing next to them with a grease gun. We're going to raise the ladder to around 80 degrees, and then we're going to rotate. It's a slow rotation, and during that slow rotation, the firefighter with the grease gun is going to apply 2 pumps of grease, pause, 2 pumps of grease, pause, for the entire 360 rotation. And then again, this is the turntable rotation bearing, and you'll need to look at your specific manual on where that grease point is on your truck. All right, now we've moved on to the rotation bearing teeth. When you look on your ladder, it's basically the 2, there's a large gear and a small gear. What we need to do is prep that for new grease. So the guys right now are taking rags that are damped with degreaser, and they're running the rag in between the teeth. We're just removing some of the old grease. Once that has been removed, we're going to apply clean grease, and we can do it with our fingers. We can dip it in the heavy duty number 2 grease, or we could take one of those brushes that I showed you earlier, and then you could brush the grease in between each of the teeth. This, when we're doing this process, it's easier if the ladder is left raised at an 80-degree angle or a 70-degree angle, whichever, but it gets the aerial out of your way so you can get access to the gear, and also to have the truck off, just completely off. We don't want to take any chance of this gear wheel moving and pinching someone's fingers. So we'll just continue and watch the guys work, and they'll be prepping and then applying new grease. We finished with the fifth wheel teeth, and now we're on to the last step. So the last step is extending the ladder, full extension, and retracting, and extending, full extension, and retracting. We then are going to rotate 360, and we're also going to extend the ladder over the side of the area within height of the firefighters. What we're going to then do is walk down the aerial and look at the waterway and a buildup of grease that can collect around the waterway bearings. Just from the extension and retraction, we might have applied a little too much grease, but this is where we want to double check that. If we have a buildup of grease around that waterway bearing or that seal, we want to just wipe it clean. Also, we want to look at the guide blocks or the guide pads. We might have some buildup grease there. We just want to wipe that out of the way. When that's finished, we're going to completely bed the ladder, and then this process is finished. In closing, we really hope that this video helps you in the care and maintenance lubrication of your aerial tillers. Remember, this should be done around every 3,000 miles or every 6 months. And this video is going to be compressed, so in real time, it's about a 1 to 2 hour process depending on how many people you have assisting. But I would like to take the opportunity to thank the firefighters behind me I've got John and Alex and Mike and Dominic who helped today with this long process of filming. I would also like to thank Captain Towns and Lieutenant Bill Jackson and Lieutenant Jared Kreitz from Station 8 and all those assigned to Station 8 that have helped maintain this ladder and the ladders before, and that have taught us this process that we're sharing with you. So other than that, good luck and thank you.